We turn now to the topic of jazz rock in our story of the history of rock music in the 70s here. Jazz rock is a funny kind of stylistic orphan in the history of popular music. To a lot of rock musicians, especially when we talk about jazz rock fusion of the Miles Davis, John McLaughlin, Mahavishnu Orchestra, Return to Forever brand, that music is thought by most rock musicians and rock critics as not really being rock. And in the history of jazz, it's thought by a lot of jazz historians as not really being jazz. So it really is, by virtue of its bringing together of jazz and rock music, falls into a place, a kind of a no man's land, no person's land, of kind of, being so stuck between two styles that it isn't claimed by either style as part of its history. We're going to claim it as part of the rock history because it was, I think, an important part of rock music, especially in the early 1970s. Of course, it had roots in the 60s, especially in the more improvisational kinds of extended pieces that Cream was doing when they would let Eric Clapton loose for a while to play extended solos. The Grateful Dead we talked about in their improvisatories. This whole idea of improvising, kind of just letting it flow on stage, was very much sympathetic with jazz music. The jazz influences of jazz rock provided a model for the technical mastery needed for ambitious rock music. So when you think about what does it mean to be a virtuoso on an instrument, there are probably two styles during this period that you're going to refer to. We've already talked with regard to progressive rock about the use of classical music. Anybody would have said at the end of the early 70s, who are the great virtuosos in music? And they would have referred to fantastic classical pianists or violinists or these kinds of people who just sort of, could play the violin or the piano in ways that just dazzle you with their fantastic virtuosity. But the other place that virtuosity was really obvious was in jazz music. Everybody knew that John Coltrane, Charlie Parker were tremendous virtuosos in jazz music. In fact, one of the arguments that jazz musicians made is we're just as virtuosic as people in classical music. You've probably heard it said, jazz is America's classical music. So there was a self-conscious attempt on the part of the jazz musicians to cast themselves as being equal to the classical musicians. But looking at it from the rock perspective, you see both of those as possible sources of virtuosity and exquisite musicianship. And so what we're talking about in this lecture is how that jazz element made its way into rock music. Of course, jazz requires advanced improvisatory skills. It's almost all about the improvisatory skills, right? And so a lot of pop and rock studio musicians during this time, even in the 60s, were from a jazz background because jazz musicians could read charts. Some of the most important people who worked on Phil Spector records and Coasters records and even Beach Boys records, like, for example, guitarist Barney Kessel was a fantastic jazz guitar player who made his regular money playing in studios in Los Angeles, and there were a lot of guys like that. This idea of the guy who's in the studio who plays these tunes, who's a supreme, fantastic musician with supreme reading skills, can read anything that's in front of them immediately on the first take without making a mistake. This led to the whole notion of the studio musician. The studio musician was celebrated as the very top of what it is to be a musical professional as an instrumentalist. You can play in any style, you can read anything, you can do anything. Just tell me, I go. And that's what a studio musician was. And in many ways, the jazz influence and the jazz rock thing sort of fed into this whole idea of studio musicians in an interesting kind of way. Jazz rock fusion begins pretty much with Miles Davis. Albums like Bitches Brew from 1970, we might also mention In a Silent Way, sort of brought together Miles's idea of what a long Cream jam would sound like if he got jazz musicians to do it. He brought in guitarist John McLaughlin. He probably would have preferred to have Jimi Hendrix, but he brought John McLaughlin, and John McLaughlin was kind of doing what Miles thought was the kind of Jimi Hendrix thing in his jazz music, very modal, very static harmonically, not the fast changes that we're used to from bebop and other kinds of tunes, not really sort of atonal or experimental in those kinds of ways, but very much sort of in the kind of modal jazz rock kind of thing that came to be standard. We mentioned John McLaughlin McLaughlin, his group, the Mahavishnu Orchestra, is an interesting blend of the kind of East meets West tradition that we saw going all the way back to Norwegian wood and George Harrison's use of the sitar, and the whole kind of embrace of Indian philosophy and lifestyle and these kinds of things that had happened during psychedelia. Now you've got John McLaughlin, a guitarist, jazz rock guitarist, who openly embraces Eastern music and calls, adopts the name Mahavishnu John McLaughlin and calls the group the Mahavishnu Orchestra. The Inner Mounting Flame is a fantastic example, their first album from 1971, of the virtuosic guitar playing of John McLaughlin. Jan Hammer, who would later in the 80s do all the music for Miami Vice, for those of you who are television fans, is on keyboards, and Billy Cobham on drums, and just some fantastic playing going on, very virtuosic. Again, no singing whatsoever. This is all instrumental music, like so much jazz. Herbie Hancock sort of picks up the jazz rock sort of funk connection. The album Headhunters from 1973 and the song Chameleon really kind of sort of established the kind of the archetypal approach to the blending of funk together with jazz and rock. Other important groups that didn't cross over so much onto the pop charts would be Return to Forever, led by Chick Corea and featuring at one point virtuoso guitarist Al Di Meola, and Weather Report, featuring Joe Zawinul and Wayne Shorter, both guys who had played in Miles Davis's band. In fact, if you take the Bitches Brew band and you just see all the people that were in that group, they all really sort of fall out into the rest of jazz fusion that occurs during the first half of the 1970s. As we talk about jazz rock fusion, this is probably the place to mention Frank Zappa. Because Zappa is so stylistically diverse, it's very difficult to find a place to put him into our discussion, but probably the best place is in the jazz rock category, because his music was so technically demanding in many kinds of ways, and he used a lot of these highly skilled sort of studio players as band members, a whole long list of important musicians throughout his career. Of course, those who know Zappa's music know that he has a penchant for cynical satire that at times challenges good taste, and that's probably a very polite way of putting it. The vocals are often sort of cartoonish, and there are references to all kinds of vulgar things, but not done in a way that's vulgar, but in a way that's almost like trying to tweak your parents by saying bad words. That's a whole, I think in Zappa's music, it's a whole way of defeating people taking it too seriously, is to have these lyrics that are clearly kind of satirical and fun-loving and this kind of thing. The music itself, though, was often extremely serious. Zappa also composed art music. There are pieces for symphony orchestra and for chamber groups that are totally serious pieces of music in the sense that they could be played in a classical music concert and have been conducted by conductors as illustrious as Pierre Boulez. A good representative example of Zappa from this period is Overnight Sensation from 1973. If you want to hear some of what I'm saying about his naughty humor, check out the song Dynamo Hum. Let's turn to the music of Traffic now, into a British group featuring Stevie Winwood, who was the original version of Traffic was the group that Stevie Winwood went to after leaving the Spencer Davis group. And by 1967, that original group, Traffic, had a sort of psychedelic single with Paper Sun. If you've never heard Paper Sun from 1967, it's a fantastic piece of British psychedelia. It's amazing how many Stevie Winwood fans don't know that tune. But probably representative of the next sort of version of Traffic is the Low Spark of High-Heeled Boys from 1971, which really kind of brings together the kind of jazz mentality with the kind of blues and soul of Stevie Winwood's sort of singing and keyboard playing. So Traffic probably best discussed sort of in this jazz rock context. In terms of bands that really brought jazz in an obvious way, but kept a very sort of pop approach, Steely Dan is one of the most important ones that we should mention in that category, led essentially by Donald Fagen and Walter Becker. Initially, for the first couple of albums, there was a real band there, but Fagen and Becker eventually decided that it was sort of better for them to do the albums without a real band and just use top New York and Los Angeles session musicians. So a good example of the early band-based tunes would be a song like Reelin' in the Years from 1973, A good example of the more sort of studio-based stuff would be the album Asia from 1977. There's actually a video of the making of Asia or classic albums or something like that, where you can see them going through different tracks and just fading up all the different versions of guitar solos they had for different tunes. I mean, they would just bring in a who's who of studio guitar players and say, well, have a run at this, you know, and just decide which one they were going to use. That's sort of the way those records were done. Also, one thing we should say about these Steely Dan records, they are fantastically well recorded. If you want a representative example of what stereo is, as opposed to the mono wall of sound stuff that we talked about with regard to Phil Spector in the first half of the course, just put on Steely Dan's Asia with some headphones and just sit back and concentrate on where the sound seemed to be coming from. It's a fantastically engineered record, won all kinds of records in its day, but is representative of this sort of studio mastery kind of thing that I've been mentioning as part of the 70s mentality. Let's move on and talk just for a minute about horn-based groups. Because when we talk about jazz, we think about jazz as basically being a kind of a horn-based music as opposed to rock, which is more of a kind of a guitar-based music, right? And so the use of horns, very important. An early example of sort of this tendency is the group Blood, Sweat, and Tears. Now, the original Blood, Sweat, and Tears was formed by Al Kooper, who, as you may recall, came up in our discussion because he produced Lynyrd Skynyrd, and in the first part of the class because he played with Dylan on a lot of those early hits, 65, 66, played organ, and was a good friend of Dylan's. Well, the original Blood, Sweat, and Tears released an album in 1968 called Child is Father to the Man, an often overlooked record. I recommend it to you because it's got some fantastic stuff on it, but that version of the group broke up, and the one that we really know is the group led by David Clayton Thomas, the singer. And tracks like Spinning Wheel from 1969, Lucretia McEvil, those kinds of things, really became the kind of emblematic of what Blood, Sweat, and Tears was, which was kind of a big band slash Stax slash R&B kind of group with a lot more ambition in terms of the horns. They do a great track on one of the records, which is their version of the Rolling Stones' Sympathy for the Devil, called Sympathy for the Devil / Symphony for the Devil, where they do a lot of sort of atonal, almost sort of avant-garde concert music kinds of things with the horn. So there's that hippie ambition making its way into this horn music. And then, of course, the most commercially successful of these groups is the band Chicago, coming out of, guess where? Chicago, Illinois. Their first album is maybe the best example of the sound the group had during the first half of the 70s. That album, called Chicago Transit Authority, released in 1969. Tracks like Does Anybody Really Know What Time It Is, Beginnings. Both of those give us a pretty good example of their blend of kind of ambitious horn writing together with a real Beatle-esque kind of approach to songwriting. Peter Cetera, the bassist for the group, is the sort of high vocalist. Robert Lamb, the keyboard player for the group, does a lot of the lower vocals on the tunes. I think both of those tunes that I just mentioned are Robert Lamb tunes. And the guitar player also did some vocals. So a very interesting group in many kinds of ways. A group that released its albums in sequence with numbers. So it was after the first one, it was Chicago 2, Chicago 3, Chicago 4. I think they're up to about Chicago 75 by now. But nevertheless, a fantastic group and very representative of what was happening with jazz rock from the sort of pop horn-based side. Well, we've covered jazz rock. Now it's time to turn to theatrical rock in the first half of the 1970s.